They are the most lethal human beings on Earth. Trained for years. Selected from thousands. Trusted with missions that governments will never officially admit happened. And yet, if you pass them on a dusty street in Kandahar or a back alley in Mosul, you would never look twice. Scuffed boots. Civilian jackets. Patchy beards that no military barber would ever approve. Gear that looks like it was pulled from 3 different army surplus stores and thrown on in the dark. This is not an accident. It is not laziness. And it is absolutely not a lack of discipline. It is a deliberate, calculated strategy, one forged over more than a century of warfare, that has saved lives, unlocked intelligence, and opened doors that no amount of firepower ever could. Today, we are going to break down exactly why the world's most elite fighting forces look the way they do. We will go back to the poison gas clouds of World War I, trace the decisions made in North African deserts and occupied French villages, and land in the mountains of Afghanistan, where a beard was not a fashion statement, it was a survival tool. Stay with me, because this story rewrites everything most people think they know about military discipline. To understand why elite soldiers today grow beards, you first have to understand why the rest of the military was ordered to shave, and how serious that order really was. April 22, 1915. Ypres, Belgium. Allied soldiers hunkered down in their trenches watched a strange yellow-green cloud drift toward them from the German lines. Some thought it was a smoke screen. Others assumed it was fog rolling in off the fields. Within minutes, men were choking, clawing at their throats, collapsing. It was chlorine gas, approximately 168 tons of it, released along a 4-mile front. It was the first large-scale deployment of chemical weapons in modern warfare, and it was catastrophic. Thousands of soldiers were killed or permanently injured in a matter of minutes. The soldiers caught in that attack had nothing. Some pressed wet handkerchiefs to their faces. Others, in desperation, urinated on cloth and held it over their mouths. None of it worked. The gas moved faster than anyone could respond, and no amount of improvisation stopped the burning. The scramble that followed was immediate. Military engineers across the Allied nations rushed to develop something, anything, that could protect soldiers from chemical attack. Within months, the first gas masks began appearing at the front. Early versions were little more than canvas hoods soaked in chemicals, but they were better than nothing. And they all shared one critical design requirement: a seal. A tight, complete, unbroken seal between the mask and the soldier's skin. Here is where facial hair enters the story. It does not take a scientist to understand the problem. Stubble, even a few days of growth, creates microscopic channels along the jawline and around the nose. Gas molecules do not care how brave a soldier is. They find gaps the way water finds cracks in a dam. And in a chlorine or mustard gas attack, even a small leak, even a partial exposure, could blind a man, sear his lungs, or kill him over the course of days in agony. By 1916, the British War Office made it official. Every soldier must shave, every day, without exception. The order rippled outward across Allied armies. The United States military codified it in field manuals. Commanders enforced it not as a cosmetic rule but as a matter of survival, because they had seen firsthand what happened when masks failed. Over the following decades, the clean-shaven face became woven into the identity of professional soldiering. It was discipline made visible. Order made physical. A soldier who shaved was a soldier who was ready, who respected the equipment, respected the uniform, respected the mission. But the rule had roots in a very specific threat. The gas mask rule, where it all began. And when that threat changed, some soldiers began to ask, what happens when the real danger is something else entirely? The first rebels, Lawrence, the SAS, and the Jedburgh teams. The history of soldiers breaking uniform rules to survive goes back further than most people realize. And the first innovators were not undisciplined or reckless. They were strategists who understood something fundamental. In certain environments, looking like a soldier makes you a target, not a warrior. Consider T. Lawrence, the man history remembers as Lawrence of Arabia. In 1916, Lawrence was operating in the Arabian Peninsula, working to coordinate a revolt among Arab tribal fighters against the Ottoman Empire. He was a British Army officer, but he quickly realized that showing up in British khakis was a liability. The tribal leaders he needed to win over had their own code, their own hierarchy, their own measures of respect. A man in a foreign uniform was, at best, a curiosity. At worst, he was an occupier. So Lawrence changed. He adopted Arab dress, long flowing robes, a dagger at his belt, the headwear of the region. And he wrote plainly about why, if you could dress and move as the local people did, you could gain their trust and their honesty in ways that a uniform simply made impossible. He was not trying to deceive anyone. He was trying to belong, to earn a seat at the table rather than standing awkwardly outside it. This idea did not die with Lawrence. A generation later, it would be tested under far more dangerous conditions. During the North African campaign of World War II, the British Special Air Service, the SAS, faced an environment where standard uniforms were worse than useless. The desert did not care about dress codes. What mattered was not being spotted by German patrols, not dying of heat, not running out of water because your kit was designed for a European climate. SAS teams operating deep behind enemy lines began adopting local clothing, scarves, and adapted gear that let them move through the landscape like shadows rather than targets. Then came 1944 and the Jedburgh teams, small, specially trained units parachuted into Nazi-occupied France to organize and assist the French resistance. They went in wearing civilian clothes. This was an enormous risk. Under the laws of war, a combatant captured out of uniform could be shot as a spy rather than held as a prisoner of war. These soldiers accepted that risk because the alternative, parachuting in full military gear, would have made them instantly identifiable and drastically reduced their ability to move, recruit, and survive. These were not rogue decisions. They were calculated ones, approved at the highest levels, made because the mission demanded it. And they established something important. There are circumstances where the most effective warrior is the one who looks the least like one. Afghanistan 2001, the beard becomes a tool. Now jump forward to October 2001. The September 11th attacks were weeks in the past. The United States military was mobilizing for what would become the longest war in American history. And the first boots on the ground in Afghanistan were not from a conventional infantry division. They were small, 12-man teams from the Army Special Forces, the Green Berets. These teams had a mission that sounded nearly impossible. They were being inserted into a country most of them had never visited, in a culture many of them were still learning, to build alliances with local warlords and fighting forces against the Taliban. They had minimal air support. They had no large base of operations to fall back on. They were operating on trust, improvisation, and cultural intelligence. And very quickly, they figured something out. The gear did not matter as much as the face. In Pashtun culture, the dominant culture in large parts of Afghanistan, a man's beard is not decorative. It is communicative. It carries meaning that predates any modern military doctrine by centuries. A beard signals that a man has passed out of youth, that he has entered the world of adult responsibility, that he is someone whose words carry weight. Among village elders and tribal leaders, a clean-shaven face, particularly on a foreigner, could read as immaturity, or even as a kind of disrespect. A signal, however unintentional, that you did not understand or honor the culture you had entered. Anthropologists who have studied Pashtun society describe a code of honor, known as Pashtunwali, that governs every aspect of social life. Appearance is part of that code. Not in a superficial way, but in a deeply structural way. Who you look like determines who will talk to you, what they will say, and whether they will trust you enough to warn you when danger is coming. Green Beret teams operating with the Northern Alliance and other local partners began letting their beards grow almost immediately. They swapped American military headgear for the Pakal caps worn locally. They wore local tunics when the situation called for it. Photos from those first months in Afghanistan look nothing like anything you would see in a military recruiting brochure. These were men who had deliberately chosen to look like the landscape they were operating in. One account from a member of ODA 595, the team that famously rode on horseback alongside General Dostum's Northern Alliance cavalry, describes a first meeting where their Afghan counterpart looked them over, took in the beards and the local kit, and visibly relaxed. The conversation that followed was open and direct in a way that might not have been possible otherwise. The appearance broke down a wall before a single word about strategy was spoken. This was not about camouflage in a military sense. It was about belonging. It was about communicating, without speaking, that these Americans had made an effort to meet their partners where they were. And the results were measurable. Teams that successfully integrated into local culture gathered more intelligence. They received earlier warnings about Taliban movements. Local sources were willing to name names, describe routes, identify threats. Veterans from that period have spoken about the direct connection between appearance and information flow. One retired Special Forces soldier put it simply: elders who had been reluctant to engage at all began opening up once the beards grew. The intelligence that came from those conversations kept people alive. The contractor silhouette, urban operations, and low visibility. The beard in Afghanistan was one piece of a larger puzzle. As the wars in Iraq and Syria evolved, and as special operations expanded into urban environments, the logic of adaptive appearance adapted with it. Cities create a different kind of challenge than mountains do. In a rural village, belonging means looking like a farmer or a tribal elder. In a city, in the crowded markets of Baghdad or the border towns of Syria, belonging means not looking like a military target. Not giving a hostile observer, a potential spotter for an IED cell, or an opportunistic smartphone camera a reason to flag you. This is where what some operators call the contractor silhouette comes in. The look is deliberate and layered. A ball cap instead of a helmet. Civilian pants or jeans instead of camouflage. A flannel shirt or a plain jacket layered over a plate carrier. Boots that are worn and broken in rather than freshly issued. The gear is still tactical, the protection is still there, but the visual profile is dialed down. The obvious signals of American military presence are reduced. Why does this matter? Because in the modern threat environment, being identified before an operation begins is not just embarrassing, it is operationally catastrophic. A single photo posted to social media can compromise a mission, expose a safe house, or put a team's movement pattern in the hands of the wrong people within minutes. In an age of ubiquitous surveillance cameras and connected devices, reducing the obvious visual signature is not paranoia. It is basic tradecraft. There is also a psychological dimension. Operators who move through ambiguous environments in mixed or civilian-adjacent clothing project a different kind of presence than uniformed soldiers do. They appear unpredictable. Experienced. Not bound by the standard rules. That unpredictability has its own deterrent value. And in communities where trust in uniformed foreign forces may be low or complicated, the reduced military profile can make initial contact and relationship building more feasible. Comfort, too, is not a luxury, it is a performance factor. Multi-day operations in mountains or through urban terrain require gear that moves with the body, breathes in heat, and insulates in cold. Standard military issue does not always meet that bar. Operators mixing in civilian technical gear, quality hiking layers, broken-in boots, commercially available packs, are often better equipped for sustained endurance than they would be in full standardized kit. Every piece of the look serves the mission. Nothing is chosen for style. The institutional pushback, what happens inside the building. Now, not everyone inside the military has been comfortable with any of this. For the institutions themselves, the policy officers, the senior commanders, the career administrators who manage the bureaucratic machinery of large armed forces, the relaxation of appearance standards raises real concerns. And those concerns are not entirely without merit. The clean-shaven, squared-away look has functioned as a visible symbol of military discipline and cohesion for generations. It communicates, at a glance, that soldiers are professional, that they follow rules, that they are reliable. When units begin operating outside those norms, even for legitimate operational reasons, it creates questions. If beards are allowed for special operations, why not for everyone who asks? Where does the exception end? Does visible nonconformity signal that the standards themselves do not matter? Some senior leaders have argued that the waiver system, the formal process by which special operations units receive permission to deviate from grooming and uniform standards, creates a two-tier military culture. Tier 1, the elite units, operate by their own rules. Tier 2, conventional forces, enforce standards that their elite counterparts openly disregard. That perception, the argument goes, corrodes unit cohesion and morale across the force. In 2017, the U.S. Army updated its regulations, specifically Army Regulation 670-1, to formally codify a process for grooming waivers in special operations contexts. By that point, roughly 80% of deployed special operations personnel were already operating under such waivers. The regulation caught up with reality. But the tension did not disappear. The counterargument, made consistently by special operations leaders and veterans, is straightforward. The waiver system exists precisely because the mission determines the requirements. The standard exists to serve effectiveness, not the other way around. When following the standard reduces effectiveness, when a shaved face closes doors that a beard would open, then insisting on the standard is not discipline. It is rigidity. And rigidity, in a combat environment, costs lives. The debate continues. It is unlikely to be fully resolved, because it touches something fundamental about how institutions balance uniformity with adaptability. The risk calculation, gas masks versus ground truth. Let us come back to the original tension. Because it has not disappeared. The reason militaries mandated daily shaving in the first place was real and serious. Chemical weapons can and do kill. The seal between a gas mask and a soldier's face is a genuine, measurable, life-critical factor. Facial hair breaks that seal. That is not a matter of opinion, it is physics. So how do special operations commanders justify sending their personnel downrange with beards, knowing that a chemical attack would potentially compromise their respiratory protection? The answer is a risk calculation, the same kind of calculation that military commanders have always made, weighing probability against consequence, immediate threat against long-term mission requirements. In the conflict environments where American Special Operations Forces have operated most extensively over the past 2 decades, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, confirmed chemical weapons attacks against U.S. ground forces have been extraordinarily rare. There have been incidents involving chemical agents, particularly in Syria, but direct attacks on small special operations teams using gas as a primary weapon have been nearly non-existent. The actual daily threats those teams face are ambushes, improvised explosive devices, insider attacks, and the steady erosion of operational security. Those threats are immediate, frequent, and concrete. The beard, in that environment, is not a vulnerability. It is a tool that actively reduces other, more likely threats by enabling the trust and cultural access that generate life-saving intelligence. But the calculus is not fixed. When credible intelligence indicates a real chemical weapons threat in a specific area of operations, the order comes down immediately: shave. No exceptions. No arguments. Razors go in the pack on day one, and operators remain ready to adapt their appearance to the threat environment at any moment. This is what distinguishes the approach from simple rule-breaking. The beard is conditional. It is tied to the mission and the threat picture. It is a tool to be used when useful and set aside when the risk profile changes. That is not an absence of discipline, it is discipline applied with precision rather than applied by habit. What this tells us about modern warfare. Pull back and look at the full picture, and what you see is something important about how conflict itself has changed. For most of military history, the goal was to be unmistakably present. Uniforms were designed to be visible, bold colors, distinctive insignia, obvious national identity. The logic was partly about morale, partly about the laws of war, and partly about coordination on a chaotic battlefield. You needed to know, at a glance, who was friend and who was enemy. Modern special operations work in a different logic. The value of many high-stakes missions depends on not being identified. On moving before the enemy knows you are there. On building relationships that require being perceived as something other than a foreign military force. On operating in ambiguous spaces where rigid identity is a liability. The beard, and everything else about the adaptive appearance of elite forces, is a physical expression of that shift. It is the external signal of a deeper change in how some of the most sophisticated military organizations in the world think about presence, identity, and effectiveness. And here is the paradox that brings us full circle: the thing that looks least like military discipline, the scruffy beard, the civilian jacket, the mismatched kit, is, in context, an expression of extraordinarily precise and sophisticated discipline. It is the discipline of knowing when to break the rule. Of understanding what the rule is actually for, well enough to recognize when following it would betray its purpose. That requires more judgment, more training, and more cultural and operational intelligence than simply shaving every morning and putting on the standard uniform. The question that remains. Here is where we land. The world's most capable fighting forces will keep adapting. The threat environments they operate in will keep changing. The tension between institutional standardization and operational flexibility is not going away. It is a permanent feature of how large organizations try to do complicated things in chaotic places. The question is whether the institutions themselves can keep pace with the reality their best people are navigating on the ground. Whether the policy will stay flexible enough to serve the mission, or whether the pull toward uniformity and comfort will eventually tighten the rules in ways that cost access, cost intelligence, and ultimately cost lives. History suggests that the battlefield tends to win that argument. The lesson from Ypres to Afghanistan, from the Arabian Desert to occupied France, is consistent. The most effective soldiers are the ones who understand what the tools are for, and who have the judgment to use them correctly, even when correctly means breaking the obvious rule. That is the real story. If this kind of deep dive is what you are here for, the history behind the headlines, the reasoning inside the decisions, subscribe and join the people who want to understand how the world actually works, not just how it appears to.